Okay, let's see if we can everyone hear me? Okay. So we're experiencing now a renewal and a renaissance in Catholic education in America. Actually, it's more than a renaissance, it's more than a renewal. There has never been in the United States such a popular movement for the erection and promotion of liberal arts schools amongst lay Catholics. I've been involved in, as she said, Catholic education, classical education for 20 years. And in the past decade, I've seen nearly every diocese, every city throughout the country seek to found both Catholic high schools, Catholic elementary schools, and sometimes Catholic universities, all in the liberal arts model. This is simply unprecedented in the United States. And what's remarkable to me is that there really appears to be no centralized body that organizes all this. There's no charismatic leader that everyone follows, nor even is there necessarily a consistent body of pedagogical principles from which we all operate. What there is, instead, is a deep and abiding concern on the part of parents, priests, bishops, and religious that the common culture in which we live has become deeply anti-Catholic and in many ways anti-human. And so we've taken on the task to be courageous and daring in preserving the great gift of our faith. There is also the growing concern that our schools, and in our schools, that there is a growing divide between our faith and the curriculum and culture of those schools. We feel that we've lost something. We feel that we need to recover something. And so the classical school movement, the liberal arts school movement, is therefore oftentimes called a renewal, a rebirth, and described as a recovery of an old form of schooling, something that we used to have. But we rarely ask the question, a renewal of what? A renewal, a rebirth of what type of school? We're not refounding the academies of Athens. We're not recreating the catechetical schools of the early church. We're not renewing medieval Catholic cathedral schools. No, we're renewing Catholic education, liberal education in America. But we don't ask the question, what was Catholic education, Catholic liberal education in America? And the reason I wanted to give this talk is because I realized not that long ago that as much as I knew about ancient models of education, what Plato says about education, as much as I knew about the medieval universities and their founding, as much as I knew about Enlightenment pedagogical theory, I knew next to nothing. Well, I've written next to nothing. That's not true. I knew nothing about Catholic education in America. How did we teach our young men and women? And this dawned on me recently, last spring, when I was forced to drive out to Upper Marlboro for jury duty. I don't know if any of you have had to do that. It's awful. And I was selected for jury duty with, and I had to do a disability case. Everybody was guilty, by the way, in my view. Everybody was guilty. And as I was parking, I had to walk by the old homestead of John Carroll, the first Bishop of Baltimore. And I suppose I knew somewhere in the back of my mind that Carroll was the first Bishop of America. And I suppose I'd heard somewhere as well that he'd been born in Prince George County. And I suppose I knew somewhere as well that he was the original founder and visionary behind Georgetown College and University. But it all of a sudden hit me that I lived very much in the cradle of American Catholicism. I really lived in the place where Catholic education in America had begun, and I knew nothing of my own history. I talked of renewing Catholic education in a place, but I didn't even know what that education had been. So this hit me as something as a moral failing, because I believe, and I'll argue at length to anyone who will listen, that place is important, and that knowing and loving our own forefathers is an important part of the virtue of piety. And so I undertook this project really as a project of discovery, to learn something I did not know. So I am not an expert on the American Catholic experience during the Revolution, nor am I an expert on the biography of John Carroll. But I am someone who is deeply interested, both in my work and academically, in education, and have been working over the past 20 years to renew it because I believe the American political order and the church depends on good families and good schools. And when I started to look into this, I discovered something that really surprised me. John Carroll, the first bishop of America, the son of PG County, believed that the most important project of his episcopacy was the foundation of a liberal arts Catholic high school. Now, he used the word college, but what he was describing at that time would be much more familiar to us as a high school. In 1783, just before his appointment to the colony as superior to the missions of the United States, Carroll wrote to his former classmate, close friend, and fellow Marylandian, Charles Plowden, of his great excitement about the experiment occurring in the American colonies. The letter is very informative about Carroll as a person and what he thought about America, but immediately after expressing this great enthusiasm for the Revolution, he writes to his friend that the object nearest to my heart is to establish a college in this continent for the education of youth. Later on, in another letter to Plowden, he thanks Plowden for his generous financial support of the future Georgetown and claims that the school and liberal education in general will be the main sheet anchor of Catholicism in America. Now, this is an interesting image. For those of you who aren't up to speed on your nautical terms, a sheet anchor is the heaviest anchor on the ship. It is the one that gets thrown out only when the ship is in the most extreme danger. When all else fails, the sheet anchor holds the ship in place and preserves it from destruction. And this is the image he uses to describe liberal education in schools in America, the main sheet anchor. Now, in one sense, it might seem obvious that the leader of the American Catholic Church would want to build a school. Catholics are always building schools. Wherever we go, we build schools. And this is, of course, kind of obvious. But if we think about the state of the American church at the time, it's actually pretty surprising. And we'll document this in more detail in a moment, but the church in America was essentially no church. It was horribly disorganized, with many Catholic groups operating essentially as autonomous churches and parishes with no ecclesial authority governing. In fact, no one to this day knows from where American priests got their faculties. It's a real problem of canonical authority. Where did they get their faculties from? We don't know. They had them, we think, but we don't know where they got them from. The church had no money. After the suppression of the Jesuits in 1773, they had no property. And many of the priests were hardly even able to speak English. On top of this, the country was itself deeply anti-Catholic, which we'll document as well in a moment. And the threat of violence against Catholics was a constant concern. And yet, one example of that violence is in 1774, when the Catholics decide in Baltimore. We think of Baltimore as a Catholic city. It wasn't. It was a Protestant city. But the Catholics in 1774 had the idea that they could start a school. It caused such a violent riot in Baltimore that the Catholics had to agree that they'd never try to start one again, because it was just so infuriating to all the Protestants and Puritans in Baltimore. So there's a constant threat of violence against Catholicism there. In this environment, Carroll suggests, again, that the thing closest to his heart, in a pastoral letter, he says it's the object of his highest pastoral solicitude. The most important project is the foundation of a high school, of a college. And not just any college for the sake of giving some practical formation. What Carroll wants is what he calls a liberal, humanistic, and classical college. So we have two questions. Or I have two questions. You might not have any questions, but I have them. Why did Carroll so desperately want to found a liberal arts college in the United States? Why did he think this type of education was his most important task as a newly ordained, well, he wasn't quite yet a bishop, but he was placed in charge of the United States? And second, what kind of education was this? And I'll spend most of the time on that first question. Why did he think it was so important? Now, one of the great challenges in looking at Carroll is that he was not, because he was a good American, he was not by any stretch of the imagination a theoretician. Although extremely well educated himself for 20 years at the best Jesuit colleges and universities, he was beset throughout his life with immense responsibilities that took him from his academic and theoretical pursuits. What we do have from him is an immense quantity of boring letters and correspondence. Some of them are interesting, but most of them are dreadful. So in trying to answer this question, imagine someone trying to read all your business emails. It's just not fun. So in trying to answer this question, we're actually left oftentimes to make inferences, where he's not totally clear about what he intends or why he's intending it. We have a pastoral letter, and we also have a work of apologetics that he wrote. But other than that, it's relatively limited. So I'll proceed in 3 stages to answer this question: why was liberal education so important for him? First, I think it's essential that we get a clear picture of the state of the church in Maryland at the time of Carroll's election as bishop. Catholicism in the American colonies was in a very emaciated state. Second, we will look at Carroll's own education in Brussels at the Jesuit College of Saint-Omer. It's an important part of the story because it's clear that Carroll wanted to create in America the exact type of education he had received at the hands of the Jesuits. Third, from this point, I think we'll be able to answer this question of why Carroll considered liberal education to be the main sheet anchor of Catholicism in America. So, let's first look at the state of Catholics in England and specifically Maryland. To do this, we'll take just a little time to focus on the way that the English monarchy attempted to asphyxiate and choke out Catholicism throughout Britain and throughout the colonies. If we go back to Elizabeth, who was really the first to implement a strategy of suppressing Catholics, Henry VIII kind of randomly killed people, but it wasn't a real systematic killing of the Catholics. With Elizabeth, there were times where she implemented very vigorous and violent persecutions, and she sought out priests, and she would send out large groups of spies to find them. She spent lots of money doing it. But the persecutions like that were actually relatively intermittent, and they were of limited efficacy. Turns out when you kill a Jesuit martyr, it makes a lot of people want to become Catholic. It had the opposite effect than what they were intending. So pretty soon, the monarchy figured out that you needed to avoid public executions and persecutions, except when you needed a boogeyman for political unity. The gunpowder plot is a great example of this. What they did instead, the strategy for undermining and asphyxiating Catholicism in England, was threefold. First, excessive taxation. 2, and this is where it's really important for us, political and educational exclusion. And 3, a constant and consistent propaganda campaign that made Catholics alien to England. So the first prong of the strategy of suppressing Catholicism in England was taxes. If you were Catholic and you did not attend Anglican services after 1559, you were charged, I think it was £10, which was quite a bit of money. So if you went to Anglican services, you did not receive that fine. It was very difficult for Catholics to do both because there weren't sufficient priests for them to both go to Mass and go to Anglican services. So this essentially destroyed Catholicism amongst the middle and lower classes in England over a few generations, simply because they couldn't afford it. So that policy took care of Catholicism in the lower and middle class. But the upper class was able to afford the fees. They were also able to afford priests that they hired to follow them around. So what the government did in order to suppress Catholics there was they made it impossible for Catholics to receive a full education or to participate at all in political life. A faithful Catholic could not hold any public office, and therefore all Catholics were relegated to a sort of ghetto. These two elements, political and educational exclusion, are actually deeply related. The type of education that the ruling gentleman class received was a liberal one. The idea was that rulers of the nation needed to have received the best and most profound education, precisely because they were directing the state to its proper ends. The most free men needed the most liberal education. Catholics were not barred from trades, but from directing the state. And they were therefore barred from a liberal education. The third prong of the sort of strategy of asphyxiating Catholicism in England was a relentless propaganda campaign that attempted to establish the identity of Englishness with Protestantism. As one historian of the era has put it, to be English was to be Protestant. To be Catholic meant that one could not be English. Catholicism was strange, paganish, slavish, ignorant, superstitious, and ultimately, worst of all, served a foreign power, the Pope, who himself wanted to destroy all that was English. He wanted to destroy freedom. He wanted to destroy property. He wanted to destroy anything related to England. My mother is English, and in fact, I remember that prejudice against Catholics even as a child. My aunt, when I was probably 8 or 9 years old, I heard her say that something was very RC. I thought she was talking about the cola, and I was very confused. But I know now what she was saying, and she sort of whispered it to my mother. She said, well, that's very RC. And what that meant was just very un-English. It was foreign, it was exotic, it was strange. So Catholics, to use a sort of the modern way of saying it, they were othered in England. And to be English meant that you could not be Catholic. So we should try to put ourselves in the position of being a faithful English Catholic at the time after Henry VIII and Elizabeth. You're English. You have no desire to leave and become Spanish, Italian, German, or God forbid, French. How do you educate your children? How do you help them preserve their faith, while all the while preserving the culture, which is your culture, which is your people, which is your homeland? How do you educate them such that they are not doomed to penury and excluded from giving themselves, more importantly, to the common good, that is to say, from participating in political life? If you remain Catholic, you are consistently and constantly under suspicion of not being really English. And the propaganda was always that you served the Pope, and you therefore could not serve the monarch. So you were excluded from giving yourself to the common good. Now, the problem of education is solved in one sense very quickly after Elizabeth's ascension. Cardinal William Allen and a number of Jesuits opened up schools in Brussels, Flanders, and France. That's we know it most in Douay. The Douay-Rheims Bible comes from those schools. So if you're a Catholic man in England, what you did to receive an English education, a Catholic English education, is you went to France to serve and learn under the Jesuits. But this only really partly solved the problem. If you were an English gentleman, you could now receive a very good education at the hands of the Jesuits, but what would you do afterwards? What would this tremendous education that you received, what could you do with it? Catholic families, therefore, felt the constant agony of their exclusion from active involvement in the political order. So this brings us to Maryland. Maryland is actually kind of a unique experience for Catholics. Elizabeth's successor to the throne, James I, was granted the title of Lord Baltimore. He granted the title of Lord Baltimore to his Secretary of State, George Calvert. He did this shortly after Calvert had resigned as Secretary of State and converted to Catholicism, or reverted to Catholicism. It's possible he was Catholic all along. In gratitude for his service, James I granted him a significant colony in the Americas along the Potomac River. The history of the founding is quite fascinating because Maryland was given what are called Durham rights. Lord Baltimore was given the power of the monarch in Maryland. He essentially had the ability to create his own courts, to create his own legislative councils, and to distribute land like the monarch. In fact, the courts did not refer their authority to the king, they referred it to Lord Baltimore. He had what were called Durham rights. Now, this is a very interesting legal structure, but one of the things it allows is for Calvert to enact and create laws that are at odds with English law. To be a Marylander meant that you actually lived under a different set of laws than if you lived in England. So one of the very first laws that Calvert enacts in 1649 is the Act Concerning the Toleration of Religion, which established religious toleration as the law of the land. It's very different than what we would think. It's actually a law that says you can't call people names. So one of the big things is there's a long list of names that Catholics can't call Puritans. So Catholics couldn't call them Roundheads, which was a really big insult. I don't know why they were called Roundheads, but it was a big insult. Or if you were Puritan, you couldn't call a Catholic a Jesuited papist. That was a very popular insult at the time. And Calvert just wants all that to stop. He just wants them to stop using these names about each other. Now, what this law allows, though, for Catholics, is that they can fully participate in political life of England. And actually, the majority of land was owned by Catholics. So that first group of colonists that came over in 1634, although the majority of people on those boats were Protestant, the majority of landowners were Catholic. And because they were the primary landowners in the colony, they possessed significant political power and authority. In Maryland, unlike everywhere else in the empire, Catholics were not only the wealthy landed gentry, but also the leading political figures. Now, we should not make this lead us to believe there was a sort of utopia for Catholics in Maryland. Even though Maryland was technically a tolerant colony, the fact of the matter is that Catholics still had to hide their Catholicism from their Protestant neighbors and their tenants, actually. Even at the peak of the Catholic Church in Maryland, the population was probably only about 20% Catholic. An example of the way Catholics had to hide their religion from their fellow colonists is the instruction that Lord Baltimore gave to his brother on the journey over to the Chesapeake. Calvert told him, his brother, who was traveling with the settlers, he writes, "All acts of the Roman Catholic religion must be done as privately as may be." So this is what the Catholics should do when they colonize this place. They need to do all their Catholic stuff in private. And he says Catholics must be silent upon all occasions of discourse concerning matters of religion. Now, Calvert had good reason for this. He had to ensure that no complaints about his colony got back to the monarch or to Parliament. Parliament was constantly trying to take over his rights and his authorities. In 1688, when the Glorious Revolution took place, Lord Baltimore was stripped of his rights as proprietor, and Catholics were again banned from political participation and education. Indeed, the anti-Catholicism of Maryland, in some ways, was more profound than that in England. In 1700, an act was passed that forbade Catholics from even sending their children to Europe for an education. So imagine you're a Catholic landed gentry, you have a son, the law says that he cannot receive a Catholic education, and you say, I know what I'll do, I'll send him to those Jesuits over in France. And the law states, no, you can't do that either. The fine for doing it was £100. And not only did you have to pay the £100, which is a large amount of money at the time, your child ran the risk of losing his inheritance. So Catholics simply couldn't receive a liberal education. They could learn to read and write, they could learn some basics. So Maryland Catholics were in a very difficult position at the time of the Revolution. By tradition and inheritance, they were situated to be the political leaders of Maryland. They owned most of the land. They understood themselves also to be the founders and directors of the colony. The great desire of Catholics at this time, and this is really clear from their correspondence, is that they be permitted to contribute to the common life of their homeland. One example of the difficulty of Maryland Catholics can be found in Charles Carroll, the cousin of John Carroll, who advised his son, also named Charles. It's really difficult to track all the Charles Carrolls that there are. He advised his son to settle in Louisiana and never to return to Maryland because the prospects for Catholics were so poor. Indeed, there are many stories of young men leaving the faith and converting to Anglicanism. Leonard Neal, a grandson of one of the first settlers of Catholics, is one example, so that they could practice law. Even Lord Baltimore, the fourth Lord Baltimore, becomes Anglican. And he becomes Anglican so he can then again become proprietor of Maryland. So by the time of the Revolution, Catholicism in America was severely weakened and emaciated. The original founders, the Catholic founders, their families were very wealthy in many cases, but they were starting to dwindle. After many years of English asphyxiation, Catholicism in Maryland was slowly shrinking generation after generation. And it is within this environment that John Carroll was born and into which he was educated. Born in 1735, Carroll came from one of the wealthiest families in Maryland. Some would say that his cousin, Charles Carroll, was the wealthiest family in America. His father was a wealthy merchant, Daniel Carroll, who married a scion of one of the founding Catholic families in Maryland, Eleanor Darnall. He was raised, that is to say, as an aristocrat who was to be responsible for the governance of his properties and the colony of which he was a part. As a young man, he was sent to a hidden Jesuit school on the Chesapeake Bay called Bohemia Manor. You can have weddings there now, if you'd like. We don't know much about the schools because all we have is lists of students and the tuition that they owed. And that's the way we know that there was a school, and a few people admit that they went there. But we have essentially no idea what went on there because they documented nothing. And then at 12, which was the custom, he was sent to Saint Omer when he was around 12 years old, so he could receive his education in humanities, Latin, philosophy, and theology. Now, the education he received there was the traditional ratio studiorum of the Jesuits, which, it has to be stated, represents one of the most rigorous and advanced curricula ever devised. For good reason, Jesuits have always been respected, even when they were hated, for the rigor of their training and education. When you call someone a Jesuit or being Jesuitical, you're not insulting their education and their formation. You might think it was done wrongly, but you recognize that they were well educated. The Ratio Studiorum was an intense training in the highest art, rhetoric, and for those who did seminary, the highest science, theology. From the very earliest moments, starting about 12, 13 years old, students were immersed in reading, writing, analyzing, and imitating the great Latin and Greek poets and rhetors for the sake simply of developing the skill of rhetoric. What the Jesuits hoped to cultivate in their students was what they called eloquentia perfecta, perfect eloquence. This seems maybe like an odd goal to us because the word eloquence indicates something accidental, something extra, something that you get later. The Jesuits, however, considered it in many ways the most essential part of their formation. And I'll quote here from their constitutions to explain why. This is the first paragraph of the fourth chapter of the constitutions of the Jesuit order. And the fourth chapter deals primarily with the education of Jesuits. It's a beautiful paragraph. I'll read it in whole. It says, "The end steadfastly pursued by the society is to aid its own members and their neighbors in attaining the ultimate end for which they were created. In order to do this, in addition to the example of one's life, learning and skill and expounding are required. Hence, once the proper foundation of abnegation of themselves and the needed progress in virtues is seen to be present in the new members, it will be necessary to provide for the edifice of learning and of skill in employing it, so as to help make God, our Creator and Lord, better known and better served." So the process of education was first, and this is really interesting, self-abnegation, the development of the virtuous life. And then second, the capacity and ability to expound and communicate it. Why? To help make God, our Creator and Lord, better known and better served. So this Jesuit education is something that Carroll spent 20 years receiving. And I do have a section here where I read how difficult it was, but we'll skip that. Only after this exhaustive education were students then allowed to engage in philosophy and theology, which were likewise rigorous and thorough. The second part, philosophy and theology, was typically pursued in the seminary. In the college, the students progressed through grammar, rhetoric, and the humanities. To give some sense of how rigorous and lengthy this education was, Carroll did not finish his college studies for 10 years. He arrived when he was 13, and he did not leave college until he was 23. He did 10 years of rhetoric. And then he did another 10 years and was not ordained until 1769. He did 10 years of philosophy and theology. He was nearly 40 years old before he was able to leave his education. He was ordained in 1769, a full 20 years after his entry at the Jesuit school in Liege. He had never returned at any point to the American colonies. The cost was too high and the danger too great. If he had returned, he ran the risk of being identified as a student at a Jesuit school and jeopardizing his family's status and wealth. So immediately, and he was highly regarded, with his career it was clear that what he was meant to be was a professor at one of the English colleges. He was ordained in 1769, but unfortunately for him, only a few short years after his ordination, and only a few short years before the Revolution in America, the Jesuit order was suppressed by Clement XIV. The suppression was totally catastrophic for Carroll. He writes numerous letters at the time, and it is clear that it causes for him, now 40 years old, a sort of existential crisis about his life. He writes to one friend, "The greatest blessing of my life that I could receive from God would be immediate death." But the suppression of the Jesuits was also disastrous for American Catholicism. The only priests in America were Jesuits. So when the Jesuit order is suppressed, what do you do? Who's in charge of the priests? What can they do? There was no organizational structure for any of the priests. They were essentially independent agents. They had no ecclesial authority, and when they asked Rome for it, Rome just said, "We don't know." They were simply uninterested in the problem of America. The only property held by the church in America was owned by the Jesuits. But if there are no Jesuits, who owns the property? It was not even clear, as I've said before, from whom the priests received their faculties to hear confessions, perform confirmations. There's a further problem that many of the American parishes, they weren't really canonical parishes, but the churches, had started to believed that lay people should be in charge of the priests. They hired their own priests. They would submit letters and advertise, and then they would hire priests to come to their places in Maryland or Philadelphia or New York. And if the priest said something they didn't like, they fired him. And in fact, when John Carroll, after he was bishop, tried to stop what's called lay trusteeism in New York one time, they dragged John Carroll out of the church and threw him in the street. And so he had this big battle trying to retake charge over the American church. So the church in America, as we can see, was in complete disarray. And so we can return to our question: why a liberal arts classical education? Why in this type of environment does he think that's the most important thing? And I'll give 3 answers to this as to why I think he thought this was the most important type of education. Number 1, because he believed that a liberal arts education was necessary for Catholics to be able to fully participate in political life. As we can see, at the time of the Revolution, Catholics were in a very low and somewhat disastrous state. As we've seen, a Catholic could not receive an education of any sort, could not participate in the political life. In practical terms, this meant that it was very difficult for a faithful Catholic to gain the learning he needed in order to become equal to his Protestant counterparts in law or any of the other professions. As I mentioned before, there are numerous examples of Catholic men leaving the church simply so that they could have a profession. The anti-Catholicism of England and early America still reigned in the majority of Americas, and it was still the commonly held view that Catholicism was not only a different religion, but represented something entirely un-English or un-American. Nevertheless, Catholics were overwhelmingly in favor of the Revolution, especially in Maryland. And John Carroll was especially in favor of the Revolution. He even attempted with Benjamin Franklin to get Quebec to join the American Revolution, or at least to provide troops against the English. In a letter to a friend written in 1783, he writes that in America, the fullest and largest system of toleration is adopted. In almost all the American states, public protection and encouragement are extended alike to all denominations, and RCs, they still use that term, Roman Catholics are members of Congress, assemblies, and hold civil and military posts as well. And in many of the letters he writes, he's just simply overwhelmed by the fact that Catholics are able to participate in political life. Now, this reason is very informative. He's simply thrilled at the prospect that he's not simply thrilled that Catholics can worship without harassment, that they can say Mass, but rather that Catholics seem to possess full citizenship in the new nation. But Catholics needed an education that suited them to lead the nation along with their Protestant confreres. Now, at the beginning of the country, in 1781 through 1782, Carroll even toyed with the idea of simply encouraging Catholics to attend Protestant American schools. And in fact, for a few years, he simply thought that it might actually be better not to have Catholic schools at all. He sort of vacillated back and forth. And the reason he gives is really interesting. In another letter he writes to his friend Plowden, and I think this is a really important quote. He writes this in 1781. He states, "Now that Catholics have been admitted to equal toleration, must we not concur in public measures and avoid separating ourselves from the community? Shall we not otherwise be marked as forming distinct views?" So if we have a school, a separate Catholic school, shall we not otherwise be marked as forming distinct views, i.e. be too Catholic? And raise a dislike which may terminate in consequences very disagreeable to us. So you can see in the background there the anti-Catholicism that he's concerned about. So his concern is that a separate school might form Catholics in such a way as to make them again foreign and strange to American sensibilities. as I've heard from some people, Catholic school might make them weird. Is it this time that Carroll became a trustee of St. John's College in Annapolis? The state appointed representatives from every religion in Maryland in the hopes that the religious leaders would help fundraise and support it. And for a time, Carroll recommended to all Catholics that they attend this Protestant public school. He makes a shift, though, in 1785, and he abandons the idea of supporting St. John's College or any other Protestant school. And he does this because he thinks, based on his experience with young men who go to these schools, that they quickly abandon the Catholic moral life. He has no complaint about their education. He simply complains that they become immoral. He does not consider them, as he says, a wholesome place for Catholics. So this gives us, I think, the second reason why Carroll considered a Catholic liberal arts college necessary for the United States. A specifically Catholic college needed to be founded for the preservation of morals and Catholic religion. We find repeatedly in his letters the claim of the need for a religious and moral education in America. Indeed, he also repeatedly claims that the political order depends on the moral life of its citizens. And in his mind, a classical Jesuit education was best suited to inculcating precisely that. He frequently repeats the phrase, or something like this, that a liberal education is for the benefit of our common country, whose welfare depends on the morals of its citizens. But it's clear that he thinks the liberal education element to be itself somewhat morally neutral. A Catholic could receive a perfectly good intellectual or political education at a Protestant school, but he was primarily concerned only with the moral environment that tended to undermine the faith. It was at this point that he renewed his quest to establish a Catholic college in Maryland for the sake of preparing young men to fully participate in public and political life. The concern, however, remains throughout Carroll's life, that the school not alienate itself from American and American spirits. There's a persistent tension in Carroll's mind about whether a separate Catholic education isolates and separates Catholics from other Americans. One way we could ask this is a Catholic education a sectarian education? An education that separates us from the whole. And this is this tension, where the Catholic schools are sectarian in nature, that becomes thematic in the 19th century debates about the proper place of Catholic schools in the United States. On the one hand, the bishops constantly expressed a very firm, and this is after Carroll, that Catholics be allowed to engage fully in the political life of the United States. They desperately wanted Catholics to be Americans. There is horror at the idea of returning to the ghettoized state of being Catholic in England. On the other hand, there is a persistent fear that non-Catholic schools tend to undermine the faith of Catholics when they attend them. And so there's a persistent attempt to create separate, isolated schools for the education of Catholics in order to prevent the moral decay that they observed at Protestant schools. We see, therefore, a constant tension in American bishops between being assimilated into American culture, while at the same time a desire to preserve their Catholic religion, culture, and moral code. The solution that was often devised was to create a curriculum identical to American Protestant schools, except in one thing, that the religion and morals would be Catholic. In the end, Carroll decided that the potential evil, in his mind, of separation from the community was less dangerous than losing Catholicism as a whole in America. The third reason, and this is the one he most frequently cites for creating is a desperate need for American priests. As we have seen, the American church was in dire straits in both its organization and in the priests that served it. When Carroll was appointed the head of the superior of the American mission, he was given the task of supplying priests for all communities of Catholics. This often turned disastrous because he had to take whatever priests came his way from Europe, whether they understood English or Americans or not. The problem that Carroll frequently encountered was that these priests more frequently caused the local population to become more anti-Catholic. There are all sorts of stories of Italians coming in and trying to make the Americans submit to their every statement like they were feudal lords and things like that. They always have a bad effect. The Europeans always had a bad effect on Americans. Either because they imprudently proselytized or because they appeared so foreign and strange to Americans. In his very first pastoral letter, Carroll enjoined Catholics to support this new college because he says, "It is notorious to you all that the present clergymen are insufficient for the exigencies of the faithful, and that they will be more and more so as the population of our country increases so rapidly, unless by the providence of our good and merciful God, a constant supply of zealous and able pastors can be formed amongst ourselves, that is, of men accustomed to our climate and acquainted with the tempers, manners, and government of the people." That is, he wanted real Americans, to whom they are to dispense the ministry of salvation. And so what he wants is a sort of elite corps of priests that are formed with the rhetorical skills of the Jesuits and also fully American, fully capable of appealing to Americans and serving them throughout the country. In fact, when another seminary was founded, St. Mary's, he complains to his friends that it was not sufficiently rigorous intellectually. He wanted it to be more deeply like the Jesuit schools. So there's more to say, but I'm over time now. What I'd like us to think about as we think about our own project of American Catholic education is this question of the relationship between being American, being Catholic, and how that influences our schools. The question that occupied Carroll should occupy us. For to be a Catholic school, a Catholic liberal school, does that make us sectarian? Does that separate us? As it says, does that isolate us? Are Catholic liberal arts schools only necessary for the formation of morals, but identical in every other way to their secular counterparts? In what way, we should ask, is a Catholic liberal education fundamentally different precisely because it is Catholic? Or is a Catholic liberal education not actually different? It's only different in the category of religion. So with that question, I want to end and then open it up to any questions. Thank you.
Ask, Bishop obviously has some issue one is the issue of shortage of priests. The other issue he talks about constantly is lack of catechesis amongst the far-flung churches that he has. I'm curious, is there a way in which he envisions the school and investigation of catechesis up and down the coast? Is there a formation of teachers, or do you just look at priests?
He thinks in the pastoral letter, his first pastoral letter, he has this idea. He tells his people, most of you won't be able to afford this, but you should still pay for it. You should still give money to the school, even though your kids won't be able to come. And he says, because the priests who receive this education will then be able to go into their parishes and give education to their kids, and to the kids that are there. So,
what I'm thinking about is essentially as you go further south. When he becomes bishop, he's got two priests in the entirety of the Carolinas.
right.
And so you might see the priest or so. Is the thought that just maybe start homes there?
That they constructed?
They constructed homes, and I'm saying that it's the same people when they don't have access to the sacraments or access to the mass.
They didn't go to their homes?
Well, he thinks about panties being very important at homes as well.
Right.
Not just in churches. So I'm just wondering what other training is needed.
I think he's thinking that the priests, he wants to have enough priests to supply for every Catholic community. Although they're far flung, there's just the only other major population of Catholics is in Kentucky,
Right.
in Bardstown, which we don't have anymore. I wish we had Diocese of Bardstown. But that's the only other where there's a significant enough density. He does talk a lot about the importance of parents. In the first pastoral letter, he focuses intensely on the need for parents to do this. But in terms of liberal education, I think he's just hopeful that the priests will be able to spread it. Yeah, thank you.
Fascinating talk.
Yeah.
So I'm reminded of a story that I heard a few years ago about an early graduate of Georgetown University who became a justice on the Supreme Court of one of the Carolinas.
South Carolina. Yeah. The first graduate of, well, he actually didn't graduate at Georgetown. He left to go to Harvard.
Okay, well, anyway, so the story, I don't want to steal your thunder,
No.
but at the time, South Carolina had a requirement for anyone who held public office that they had to swear an oath of fidelity to the truths of the Protestant religion.
Yeah.
And this graduate of Georgetown, or I guess alum or had attended, who was Catholic, took that oath and was sworn in as a justice of the Supreme Court. And he was asked by his Catholic friends, how did you take that oath? And his response was, read the words of the oath carefully. You're only swearing allegiance to the truths of the Protestant religion. So it's exactly
Jesuit.
Yeah, and the other thing I was going to say, what can I say about things?
Yeah, lead.
My late Aunt Rosie, her favorite novel, which I finally read after she died, was Come Rack, Come Rope, which is by, is it Robert Hugh Benson or Hugh Robert Benson? Robert Hugh Benson. And then he wrote other historical novels which are about the life of Catholics under the persecutions in Elizabethan England. And it's really, these are historical novels, they're true to the historical record of the written novels. And it's really quite something what our Catholic ancestors went through in England and had to suffer through that. It was over 100 years before Maryland was founded. And then even, as you recount, even after Maryland as a haven for Catholics, it was hardly a haven. And one thing I'm curious about, you mentioned Bardstown, the Diocese of Bardstown, Kentucky. As I understand it, there were Catholics in Maryland who moved to Kentucky to escape the persecutions after the Glorious Revolution. And it's interesting to me that they chose the name Bardstown because the bard is Shakespeare. And there is, as I understand, in the Shakespeare scholar community, there's a suspicion that Shakespeare was Catholic. And there's a lot of evidence in his plays that he was coming from a Catholic mindset and that his family were recusants. So I wonder if there's any connection there.
You know more about that than I do, Lee. I don't. I mean, it is, at least Shakespeare, I have no idea if he was frequently receiving the sacraments or anything, but just that his imagination was fully Catholic. He actually sort of illumines the problem of being Catholic at that time. If he were Catholic, it was impossible for him to hand it on, right? It just sort of dies. We don't even know if he was because you have to keep it so hidden. It's like that letter that Calvert writes he says, well, you know, this is a place Catholics will have toleration there. Just don't talk about it. If there's any discourse about religion, you can't bring up your Catholicism.
Okay, can I just say one more thing? the Catholic schools, the growth of the Catholic schools at the elementary level. I had read at some point that the main reason for that was that the public schools, the McGuffey reader, because most, maybe not all, but most Protestant denominations, as I understand it, they number the Ten Commandments differently from Catholics. And one of the commandments that they teach their children is no graven images. And that was cited in the McGuffey reader as evidence that Catholics are statues of Blessed Virgin Mary that were violating the graven images commandment. And so things like that were the reason that I read that the Catholic schools were created to protect Catholic children and also to educate them in their own faith as a counter.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit more than just that, but the locus of the debate for Catholics, it always centered on whether or not they could use their translation of the Bible. Is that, you probably know more about this, Seth, than I do, but that's like, and you read it and you go, this is what they're fighting about?
Oh, this is why they burned down Philadelphia. Right? Over the issue, which side of the government this was. Maybe just a month long.
When was that? Yeah, so it's in up through the 19th century, the debate is about which translation, are Catholics allowed to use their translation of the Bible? But that's sort of a proxy for all sorts of other issues, right? Is because those translations, if you read the Douay Rheims translation of the Bible, that's got a lot of the theology contained in it that the Protestants, it includes Bibles that the Protestants exclude. So for us, it looks like, I mean, if my kid went to a school, public school, and they were reading the King James Bible, you know, I'd be okay with that, you know. It's beautiful English. I prefer the English to the Douay Rheims. So it seems so strange to us, but it was actually sort of proxy for all of these theological debates, I think.
Hey, thank you so much for your talk. It was fascinating. At my school, we learned a lot about the history of Maryland and Catholic education, so it was fascinating to hear that a little bit deeper. But I just have a little tidbit of information. I'm on a mission trip last spring to New York, and apparently there are no Catholic schools actually within New York City. According to, maybe it was like elementary schools or middle schools, maybe there was a high school or something, but I was talking to the nuns and they said that most parents who have Catholic kids in New York City send their kids to like New Jersey or something like that, like commute out of the city to like actually get a Catholic education. So I would just like lead into a sort of general question, like what does the landscape of like Catholic school renewal look like in America, and like where is there the most need, and like where is it the most vibrant, and like for different parts of the country, how do you like say is the best way to do a Catholic education? Because for example, in New York City, like there's a lot of like immigrant families, families with like low income who didn't have an option for where to send their kids. There's public schools, and were really horrified by the things that they came home with. So I was curious on your thoughts.
I mean, it is really curious to me. I do think, for all sorts of reasons, that Washington D.C. is the wellspring of the movement in Catholic liberal education. And it just seems appropriate that it would happen in PG County. Actually, when I first moved here, I was shocked that this was all happening in PG County. But then when I discovered that John Carroll was from PG County, I was like, no, that's exactly right. Of course it would happen here, right where John Carroll began it. I mean, that's a really complicated and layered question. One would be the immigrants, the problem of, we think of American Catholic education as immigrant education. I mean, when I thought of the beginning of American Catholic education before researching this was, well, there weren't really any Catholics, and then the Irish came. and then we had to do something with the Irish. And they had to just shove them all into those parish schools. And that's why they were isolated, because they were immigrants. But what you see is that the problem of American Catholic of education for Catholics in America is there at the very beginning, and the problem of how do you square the claims of the church with America, how do you square those two things, it's going to deeply affect how you create, how you form your educational system. But to the larger, it would be much more difficult to talk about the landscape. But I do think that here, not just SJI, not just St. Jerome Academy, you see all sorts of examples in this area of like the burgeoning movement of renewing Catholic education. Yeah, we use renew, but like I said at the beginning, there's never been a lay movement. We have to remember that. This is a very strange thing, actually. It's a lay movement, mostly, driven by teachers and parents, who then put the pressure on their priests, who then put the pressure on their bishops, to create liberal arts Catholic schools. It's not the bishops coming down and saying, we need to do this. It's coming from the lay people. So in that, it's a renewal, but in some sense, it's totally new in the church.
Exactly that point. There's something novel when you think of the history of Catholic education, in that when we're talking about renewal of parochial schools, we're talking about something outside of the system of diocesan and parochial schools. So in terms of the renewal, the people who are most involved, do they have some hope for a reform of the parochial school system, or should that just be?
No, we have to, well, I mean, there's a practical reason it has to happen in the parochial schools as well. They have the property, right? And they have the buildings. So it's like there's all these great, wonderful buildings. And I mean, my sense is that it will happen in the next 10, 15 years. It's just necessary for the survival because the demand is going to be there from parents that these schools need to reform themselves.
Thanks again, for bringing this discussion to us. I wanted to ask, although I know we were talking about the lifetime, Carroll had Florida, there's different, we're not at the same stage with respect to the development of ideas about women's participation in political life and so forth. You can extrapolate certain of these principles of education, obviously, are universal, but in your academic group correspondence and other things, is there any sort of explicit or implicit thought of how the eventual integration of women and so forth into college and high school, college education is to be addressed or put on a shelf for the time being? Or something
I mean,
like that?
Carroll's not that interested in it, but he does encourage Elizabeth Seton, or St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, to found schools both for boys and for girls. By the time she comes onto the picture, he's really not that interested in, but he allows her to do it, and he encourages her to do it, but he doesn't get very involved. But that's the only time you really see him addressing the question of how to educate women, because he really is just concerned about forming young men to be part of the sort of ruling aristocratic class. I mean, in his mind, he's still very much part. Yeah, well, and I mean, he's just. You have to remember, Maryland was sort of founded as a feudal colony. Like Calvert actually had an idea that it would be like kind of a medieval feudal place, and they still have all of the titles and things like that of medieval England. The other colonies didn't have that, and so John Carroll is very much an aristocrat. And so he's thinking, we need men to be able to participate in political life, and he's thinking we need priests, and we need priests who Americans don't think are strange foreigners and do strange foreign things. But I don't see any places where he spends much time talking about the education of women. Yeah, it's only with Elizabeth Ann Seton that it kind of emerges.
In the modern day, a lot of parents are sending their children to Catholic schools because they feel as though their children will receive better academic experience, education in these parochial schools rather than the public schools. If these parents send their children to these schools without the intention of them grasping the moral framework, are they working against John Carroll's original intent, which was to root in the Catholic education?
Say that.
So
Who would be violating his original intent?
the parents of the children who are attending these Catholic schools without the intent to get a moral framework, they're just there for the scholastic rigor that parochial schools are providing in public schools. Does that work against the original intent of getting a moral framework?
Yeah, I mean, if you have no intention of receiving a Catholic moral framework, Carroll would have a problem with that. Carroll thinks that, because he's a good Jesuit, that before you receive any intellectual formation, you need to receive moral formation. So, I mean, that structure in that quote I had.
Didn't he do it the other way around?
What do you mean?
Well, you said spend 10 years on rhetoric.
Yeah, but that first, if you look at that Jesuit description in the constitutions, it says first self-abnegation and virtues, and once a child has achieved those, then they receive an education in rhetoric. So they would argue, and that first beginning of their Jesuit education at 13 would have involved actually going through the Ignatian exercises. But yeah, I mean, he conceives moral virtue to be a propedeutic to that. So in that sense, yeah, if you're doing it only because you want to do well on certain exams, that would not be why Carroll wanted you to go to a Catholic school. Yeah, I think take the last question and then Leslie. Yeah, okay. Okay. Oh. Yeah.
In the city of New York, there are plenty of Catholic grammar schools and high schools that are run right now that exist. They may not meet the standards of the Renaissance and Catholic education that's going on in Washington, but they exist. They're not just not there.
Like in the city?
In the city of New York, yes.
They're not huge.
It's an enormous place, and I think that the Cardinal Dolan is a fair, who's Orthodox, I assume is not in question, is a serious person about Catholic education. Again, I'm not saying those Catholic schools are overturned.
Yeah.
The kind of schools that you have achieved here or that you aspire to, but they exist. There's a dearth of Catholic schools in that Titanic Archdiocese, and it's admired to a very large diocese.
Yeah, and maybe it was like a lack of elementary schools or something like that. I'm not sure exactly. I was just talking to a group of nuns who were like really adamant about starting up their school and getting funding for it because there wasn't any options for the other children.
I'm sure there are alternative Catholic schools that could be created here and they would be a great benefit to the people in that setting. But there's not as if there's an entire absence of such schools.
Yeah, I haven't done that research. I was just speaking from own experience.
All right, thank you very much. Leslie has one final message. Thank you.